In the deepest chambers beneath Tamriel's mountains, where the sound of hammers once rang against anvils and steam hissed through bronze pipes, lie the remnants of perhaps the most enigmatic civilization ever to grace Nirn. The Dwemer, a race whose very name sparks endless debates among scholars, whose technological marvels continue to function millennia after their creators vanished, and whose sudden disappearance remains one of the greatest mysteries in all of Elder Scrolls lore. Tonight, we're going to delve deep into the underground cities and forgotten halls of the Deep Folk, exploring their incredible achievements, their fatal hubris, and the catastrophic moment when an entire race simply ceased to exist. This is a journey through time itself, following the rise and fall of a people who dared to challenge the very gods and paid the ultimate price for their ambition. But before we descend into those shadowed depths, let me set the stage for what you're about to discover. The story of the Dwemer isn't just about a lost civilization. It's about the dangerous intersection of brilliance and arrogance, about the price of rejecting divine authority, and about what happens when mortals attempt to transcend their very nature. We'll uncover how a race of engineers and architects built wonders that still baffle modern scholars, how they discovered artifacts of divine power that would reshape their entire society, and how their greatest triumph became their ultimate doom. By the end of tonight's exploration, you'll understand why the Dwemer continue to fascinate players and lore enthusiasts decades after their introduction to the Elder Scrolls universe. You'll see how their legacy shaped the political landscape of Morrowind, influenced the course of history across Tamriel, and left behind mysteries that may never be fully solved. Most importantly, you'll witness how a single moment of desperate ambition erased an entire people from existence, leaving behind only empty cities, mechanical guardians, and endless questions. So settle in as we begin our descent into the abandoned halls of the Deep Folk, where every corridor tells a story of innovation, and every chamber whispers secrets of a civilization that reached too far and fell into oblivion. The confusion surrounding the Dwemer begins with their very name, a linguistic puzzle that reflects the complex relationships between ancient peoples. To understand who the Dwemer truly were, we must first unravel the mystery of what they were called and why different cultures knew them by different titles. The races of Mer, the elven peoples of Tamriel, use the term Dwemer, which translates most directly to deep elves or deep folk. This designation wasn't chosen lightly. These underground dwellers had carved their civilization into the very bones of mountains, creating vast subterranean cities that stretched far beneath the surface world. They were the deep folk in the most literal sense, having made the depths of Nirn their domain in ways no other race had ever attempted. But here's where the naming becomes fascinating. Imperial usage favored the term Dwarven, a designation that has caused endless confusion among scholars and adventurers alike. You see, the Dwemer weren't small. Archaeological evidence from countless ruins demonstrates conclusively that they were roughly the same size as other elves and humans. Every piece of dwarven armor discovered fits standard humanoid proportions. Every doorway, every corridor, every piece of furniture suggests a people of normal stature. So, why were they called Dwarves? The answer lies in the relationships they forged with beings far larger than themselves. According to ancient fables, the moniker dwarf was given long ago by giants to their little friends. These weren't the common giants we might encounter today, but beings of truly immense proportions, possibly the legendary Aelnofe or other primordial entities. From the perspective of these massive beings, even normal-sized elves would appear diminutive, earning the Dwemer their unexpected nickname. This linguistic evolution demonstrates something crucial about the Dwemer's place in the ancient world. They weren't isolated. Despite their preference for underground living and their reputation for secrecy, they maintained relationships with other peoples, including entities of such power and size that they dwarfed mortal comprehension. The very confusion over their name hints at the complex web of alliances and interactions that characterize the early eras of Tamrielic history. Different cultures developed their own terminology based on their specific relationships with these mysterious people. Some knew them as the Deep Elves, emphasizing their subterranean nature. Others called them the Under-Elves, highlighting their position beneath the surface world. Each name carried its own implications, its own understanding of what made this race unique among the peoples of Tamriel. The Dwemer represented a remarkable branch of elven evolution, one that had diverged so significantly from their Aldmeri ancestors that they shared little beyond distant kinship with their surface-dwelling relatives. Where other elven cultures maintained connections to their ancient heritage, the Dwemer had forged an entirely new path, one that would set them apart from every other civilization on Nirn. They were descended from the Aldmer, the ancient elven progenitors, but their journey had taken them in directions that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. Their language had evolved to the point where it bore no resemblance to ancient Aldmeris. A Dwemer and an Altmer attempting conversation would find themselves as unable to communicate as if they came from entirely different worlds. This linguistic isolation reflected a deeper cultural transformation that had fundamentally altered their entire worldview. What made the Dwemer truly unique among all the races of Tamriel was their complete rejection of divine worship. In a world where every culture maintained some form of religious tradition, where gods walked among mortals and divine intervention shaped the course of history, the Dwemer stood alone in their steadfast materialism. They were the only race to explicitly reject the worship of any deities, choosing instead to place their faith in reason, technology, and their own intellectual capabilities. This wasn't simple atheism born of ignorance or isolation. The Dwemer were well aware of the divine forces that influenced Tamriel. They simply chose to reject them, believing that mortals could achieve anything the gods could through the application of knowledge, engineering, and technological innovation. This philosophical stance would prove to be both their greatest strength and their ultimate weakness. Their society reflected these values in every aspect of its organization. Unlike most other civilizations where nobility and clergy occupied the highest positions, Dwemer culture elevated engineers, scholars, and architects to positions of supreme authority. Theirs was a true meritocracy, where intellectual achievement and technological innovation determined social standing rather than birthright or divine mandate. This approach to governance created a society unlike anything else in Tamrielic history. The greatest minds were given the resources and authority to pursue their visions, leading to technological advances that other cultures would consider impossible. Steam power, mechanical automation, telepathic communication networks, advanced metallurgy that produced materials superior to anything created before or since. The Dwemer achieved all of this through the systematic application of rational thought and engineering principles. But their remarkable achievements came with a price. The level of technological sophistication they attained bred a deep arrogance toward other races. From their perspective, every other civilization on Tamriel appeared primitive and savage. They had mastered forces that others attributed to divine intervention. They had created machines that seemed to possess their own intelligence. They had built cities that functioned with mechanical precision, while other peoples still relied on crude tools and simple magic. This arrogance would color their interactions with other races throughout their history. They saw themselves as the natural leaders of Tamriel, the ones who had transcended the limitations that held back lesser peoples. Their rejection of divine authority wasn't just philosophical, it was practical. Why worship gods when you could become gods yourselves? The technological marvels that emerged from Dwemer workshops represented the pinnacle of ancient engineering. Their mastery of steam power allowed them to tap into the geothermal energy beneath Tamriel's surface, powering vast networks of machinery that operated their cities. These weren't simple tools or weapons, but complex systems that automated everything from mining operations to manufacturing processes. Their creation of the animunculi stands as perhaps their greatest achievement in mechanical engineering. These weren't merely automated machines, but constructs that seemed to possess genuine intelligence. They could interpret the actions and intentions of people around them, responding appropriately to different situations. The mechanical spiders that still scuttle through abandoned ruins, the spherical guardians that patrol forgotten corridors, the massive centurions that defend important chambers. All of these continue to function perfectly, thousands of years after their creators vanished, a testament to the incredible craftsmanship and engineering knowledge of the Dwemer. The sophistication of these machines goes beyond simple automation. They demonstrate understanding of complex principles that modern scholars struggle to comprehend. How do you create mechanical intelligence without magic? How do you build machines that can operate independently for millennia without maintenance? The Dwemer solved these problems using techniques that remain largely mysterious even today. Their mastery of metallurgy produced the distinctive bronze-gold alloy known as Dwarven metal, a substance that has proven impossible for later civilizations to replicate. This material possesses properties that seem to defy conventional understanding of metalwork. It's simultaneously harder and lighter than steel, resistant to corrosion, and capable of maintaining its structural integrity for thousands of years. Every attempt to duplicate Dwarven metal has failed, leaving modern smiths to work with inferior materials while marveling at the superiority of ancient Dwemer craftsmanship. Perhaps most remarkably, the Dwemer developed forms of telepathic communication that allowed instant contact across vast distances. Through technological means, rather than magical ones, they created networks that could transmit thoughts and information throughout their empire. This ancient form of communication technology gave them unprecedented coordination capabilities, allowing their scattered city-states to function as a unified civilization, despite being separated by hundreds of miles of underground tunnels and surface wilderness. These communication networks represented a form of primitive internet, connecting Dwemer settlements across multiple provinces and enabling the rapid exchange of information, technical innovations, and administrative coordination. The strategic advantage this provided cannot be overstated. While other civilizations struggled with the basic logistics of long-distance communication, the Dwemer operated with the efficiency of a modern, interconnected society. Their architectural achievements matched their mechanical innovations in scope and ambition. The underground cities they carved from solid rock featured sophisticated ventilation systems, running water, artificial lighting, and climate control. These weren't crude caves or simple excavations, but carefully planned urban environments designed to support large populations in comfort and security. The scale of their construction projects defied belief. Cities like Blackreach stretched for miles beneath the surface, featuring massive chambers that could house thousands of residents, workshops that produced goods for export across Tamriel, and defensive installations that could withstand sieges from the most determined enemies. The engineering required to create such spaces, to ensure their structural stability, to provide them with all the necessities of urban life, represented achievements that wouldn't be matched by surface civilizations for thousands of years. But beneath all this technological magnificence lay a fatal flaw that would ultimately doom the entire Dwemer civilization. Their greatest discovery would also become their greatest curse, setting in motion events that would lead to one of the most mysterious disappearances in all of Tamrielic history. The unity that had allowed the Dwemer to achieve such remarkable technological advances began to fracture when they discovered something that would change everything. Deep beneath the earth, in the vast cavern system known as Blackreach, Dwemer miners uncovered a substance unlike anything they had encountered before. They called it Ethereum, a crystalline material that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy and possessed properties that defied their understanding of natural law. This discovery occurred sometime after the year 221 of the First Era, during what should have been a routine mining operation in the depths of Faljadum Din. But the moment the first veins of Ethereum were exposed, the Dwemer realized they had found something extraordinary. The mineral didn't behave like conventional materials. It seemed to exist partially outside normal space and time, exhibiting characteristics that suggested connections to forces beyond the physical realm. The potential applications for Ethereum appeared limitless. Initial experiments revealed that it could be forged into items of incredible power, objects that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of crafted goods. But working with Ethereum required specialized techniques and precisely controlled conditions that pushed even Dwemer engineering to its limits. Recognizing the significance of their discovery, 5 major Dwemer city-states formed an unprecedented alliance to exploit this new resource. Arkenthams, Roldopthar, Mzulft, Betharzel, and the great underground metropolis of Blackreach itself joined forces in what should have been the pinnacle of Dwemer cooperation. Together, they would construct the Ethereum Forge, a massive facility built deep beneath the city of Betholft, designed to work with this mysterious substance under the precisely controlled conditions it required. The construction of the Ethereum Forge represented the greatest collaborative effort in Dwemer history. Engineers and architects from all 5 city-states contributed their expertise, creating a facility that incorporated the most advanced techniques their civilization had developed. The forge itself was a marvel of engineering, capable of manipulating Ethereum at the molecular level and shaping it into artifacts of unimaginable power. For a brief period, it seemed as though the Dwemer had achieved the impossible. They had created a truly unified empire based on shared technological advancement and mutual benefit. The ethereal artifacts produced by the Forge possessed capabilities that exceeded even their creators' expectations. These weren't merely superior versions of conventional items, but objects that seemed to operate according to entirely different physical laws. But the very power that made Ethereum so valuable also made it irresistible. Each of the allied city-states began to see the Forge not as a shared resource, but as a prize to be claimed exclusively for themselves. The careful diplomatic balance that had enabled the alliance started to collapse as ambition overcame cooperation. The transformation from alliance to rivalry happened gradually at first, then with accelerating intensity. Representatives from each city-state began making increasingly aggressive demands for greater access to the Forge and larger shares of the ethereal artifacts being produced. Negotiations that had once been conducted with scholarly politeness devolved into bitter arguments over rights and privileges. What had begun as disagreements over resource allocation soon escalated into something far more serious. Each city-state started to believe that their partners were plotting against them, that secret deals were being made to exclude them from the benefits of Ethereum. Trust, the foundation upon which the entire alliance had been built, crumbled beneath the weight of mutual suspicion and growing greed. The situation reached a breaking point when each of the 4 major city-states attempted to seize control of the Ethereum Forge simultaneously. What followed was not a negotiated settlement or a peaceful division of resources, but the eruption of a devastating civil war that would tear apart the very foundations of Dwemer civilization. The Ethereum Wars had begun. This conflict differed from any previous disagreement between Dwemer settlements. Where earlier disputes had been resolved through diplomatic means or limited skirmishes, the Ethereum Wars involved the full military might of each participating city-state. Advanced weaponry, mechanical armies, and sophisticated defensive systems were deployed on a scale never before seen in underground warfare. The war raged for decades, consuming resources and lives with a ferocity that shocked even the battle-hardened Dwemer. Underground cities that had stood for centuries became battlegrounds. Ancient tunnels were collapsed to prevent enemy movement. Entire districts were abandoned as the fighting spread through the interconnected network of Dwemer settlements. The technological advantages that had made the Dwemer so formidable against external enemies now turned inward, creating a conflict of unprecedented destructiveness. Animunculi designed to protect Dwemer cities now marched against other Dwemer cities. Steam-powered siege engines battered fortifications that had been built by the same engineers who had designed them. The communication networks that had enabled coordination now carried threats and ultimatums between former allies. As the decades passed, the war began to consume the very foundations of Dwemer society. The resources that had once been devoted to technological advancement were redirected toward military production. Scholars and engineers found themselves designing weapons instead of pursuing the pure research that had driven their civilization's progress. The meritocratic ideals that had elevated the best minds to positions of leadership were corrupted by the demands of military necessity. The human kingdoms of Skyrim watched this internal conflict with growing interest and opportunity. High King Geleir recognized that the mighty Dwemer Empire, which had once seemed invincible in its technological superiority, was tearing itself apart from within. The same city-states that had once presented a united front against external threats were now weakened by internal warfare and isolated from mutual support. In a campaign of remarkable speed and efficiency, High King Geleir led his Nordic armies across Skyrim in a systematic conquest of the weakened Dwemer territories. What should have been impregnable underground fortresses fell one after another to enemies they had previously considered primitive and unsophisticated. The Dwemer, divided and distracted by their internal conflicts, found themselves unable to mount an effective defense against the coordinated Nordic assault. The conquest took only 3 years, a shockingly brief period that demonstrated just how severely the Ethereum Wars had weakened the once mighty Dwemer civilization. City-states that had stood for millennia were overrun by forces they would have easily repelled during their period of unity. The great underground cities that had been marvels of engineering became occupied territories under foreign rule. This defeat represented more than just a military setback. It was a fundamental challenge to everything the Dwemer believed about themselves and their place in the world. Their technological superiority, their rational approach to governance, their rejection of divine authority, all of these had failed to prevent their conquest by peoples they had considered inferior. Yet even in defeat, the resilience that had enabled the Dwemer to carve an empire from solid rock remained unbroken. Rather than accepting their subjugation as permanent, they began planning their return from the moment the Nordic conquest was complete. The same engineering minds that had created wonders now turned their attention to the problem of liberation. For nearly a century, the Dwemer endured foreign occupation while secretly rebuilding their strength. Underground workshops hidden from Nordic oversight continued producing the weapons and machinery that would be needed for reconquest. Communication networks that the occupiers never discovered carried plans and coordination between scattered resistance cells. The technological advantages that had failed to prevent their initial defeat were carefully preserved and improved in preparation for their return. Around the year 324 of the First Era, the Dwemer struck back with a vengeance that caught their Nordic occupiers completely off guard. The same rapid coordination that had enabled their initial conquest now worked against the occupying forces. City after city was liberated in a campaign that demonstrated that the Dwemer had learned from their previous mistakes. This time, they fought not as competing city-states, but as a unified people with a common purpose. The reclamation of their territories marked a new chapter in Dwemer history, one characterized by a renewed appreciation for unity and cooperation. The lessons of the Ethereum Wars had been learned at tremendous cost, but they had been learned nonetheless. The Dwemer who emerged from their century of occupation were stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to pursue their ultimate goals. But even as they rebuilt their empire and restored their technological civilization, the Dwemer remained fundamentally changed by their experiences. The discovery of Ethereum had shown them that there were forces and materials in the world that exceeded even their advanced understanding. The Civil War had demonstrated the dangers of internal division. The Nordic conquest had proven that technological superiority alone was insufficient to guarantee survival. These lessons would shape their approach to the even greater discovery that awaited them in the depths beneath Red Mountain, a find that would make the Ethereum deposits seem insignificant by comparison. Deep in the volcanic chambers, where the earth itself pulsed with otherworldly power, Dwemer miners would uncover something that would change not just their civilization, but their understanding of the very nature of divinity itself. The heart of Lorcan lay waiting in the darkness, a divine relic of such immense power that its discovery would set in motion the final chapter of Dwemer history. And at the centre of that chapter stood a figure whose name would become synonymous with both the greatest achievement and the ultimate doom of the deep folk. Kagrenac, the chief tonal architect, whose ambitious vision would either elevate his people to godhood or erase them from existence entirely. The discovery that would ultimately seal the fate of the Dwemer came not through careful exploration or systematic excavation, but through pure chance. Deep beneath the towering volcanic peak of Red Mountain, in chambers where the very rock glowed with inner fire and the air itself seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy, Dwemer miners broke through into a cavern unlike anything they had ever encountered. What they found there defied every principle of their rational, technology-focused worldview. Suspended in the heart of the mountain, beating with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the volcanic tremors above, was an artifact of such obvious divine origin that even the steadfastly atheistic Dwemer could not deny its nature. The heart of Lorcan, the literal heart of the god who had tricked or convinced the other divine beings to create the mortal realm, lay before them like a challenge to everything they believed. This was no mere relic or ancient curiosity. This was a piece of divinity itself, cast down from the heavens in the primordial age when the gods had punished Lorcan for his role in creating Mundus. According to the oldest legends, the other Aedra had torn out Lorcan's divine heart and hurled it into the mortal realm he had helped bring into being, condemning it to remain hidden until the end of time. The heart's presence explained many things that had long puzzled the Dwemer about Red Mountain. The constant volcanic activity, the strange magical emanations that could be detected throughout the region, the way certain materials found near the mountain possessed properties that exceeded normal understanding. All of these phenomena were side effects of the divine artifact's presence, ripples of godly power that had been shaping the landscape for thousands of years. For any other race, such a discovery would have inspired immediate reverence and worship. The presence of an actual piece of divinity would have led to the construction of temples, the establishment of priesthoods, the development of elaborate rituals designed to honor and appease the divine power. But the Dwemer were not any other race. Where others saw an object worthy of worship, they saw the ultimate vindication of their technological philosophy. Here was proof that the gods were not beyond mortal reach. Here was evidence that divine power could be studied, understood, and ultimately harnessed through the application of rational principles and advanced engineering. The heart of Lorcan represented not a challenge to their atheistic worldview, but confirmation that they had been right all along to reject divine authority in favor of technological mastery. The implications were staggering. If they could find a way to tap into the heart's power, the Dwemer could transcend every limitation that had ever constrained mortal existence. They could become something beyond mortality, beyond the need for worship or divine intervention. They could, in effect, become gods themselves. This possibility consumed the Dwemer leadership with an intensity that dwarfed even their previous obsessions with technological advancement. The discovery of Ethereum had shown them materials that seemed to operate outside normal physical laws. the heart of Lorcan offered something infinitely greater: access to the fundamental forces that had shaped reality itself. At the center of this new obsession stood Kagrenac, the chief tonal architect of the Dwemer people. If the race as a whole represented the pinnacle of technological achievement in Tamriel, then Kagrenac embodied the absolute peak of Dwemer intellectual capability. His understanding of tonal architecture, the science of manipulating reality through precise acoustic vibrations and mathematical harmonics, exceeded that of any other practitioner who had ever lived. Tonal architecture itself represented one of the most sophisticated magical sciences ever developed. While other races used crude spells and incantations to achieve magical effects, the Dwemer had discovered that reality itself could be manipulated through the precise application of sound, vibration, and mathematical relationships. By understanding the fundamental frequencies that govern the structure of existence, a skilled tonal architect could alter the very fabric of the world around them. Kagrenac had spent his entire life pushing the boundaries of this discipline, developing techniques and theories that even his fellow Dwemer considered revolutionary. His workshops beneath Red Mountain had become legendary for producing innovations that seemed to border on the impossible: steam engines that operated with perfect efficiency, mechanical constructs that displayed genuine intelligence, communication devices that could transmit thoughts across vast distances. All of these achievements paled in comparison to what he now contemplated. The heart of Lorcan presented Kagrenac with the ultimate test of his theories and abilities. Here was a source of power so vast that it could potentially fuel any project he could imagine, but accessing that power would require tools of unprecedented sophistication, devices capable of safely channeling divine energy without being destroyed by the forces they sought to control. Working in absolute secrecy, Kagrenac began designing what would become his greatest and most terrible creation: 3 artifacts specifically engineered to manipulate the heart of Lorcan through tonal architecture. Each tool would serve a specific function in the complex process of divine manipulation, and together they would form a complete system for tapping into godly power. The first of these tools was Wraithguard, an enchanted gauntlet designed to protect its wearer from the devastating energies they would be manipulating. The heart of Lorcan contained power sufficient to instantly destroy any mortal who attempted to touch it directly. Wraithguard would serve as both protection and focus, allowing its wearer to safely handle the other tools while channeling the heart's energy without being consumed by it. The second tool was Sunder, an enchanted hammer crafted to strike the heart and produce exactly the volume and quality of power required for Kagrenac's purposes. This was not a simple weapon, but a precision instrument calibrated to interact with divine energy in ways that had never been attempted before. Each strike of Sunder against the heart would release carefully measured amounts of power, building toward the ultimate goal of the entire project. The third and most delicate tool was Keening, an enchanted blade designed to flay and focus the power that Sunder produced. If Sunder was the instrument that released divine energy, then Keening was the tool that shaped and directed that energy toward its intended purpose. In the ancient songs that described its creation, Keening was described as being forged from the sound of the shadow of the moons, a poetic description that hinted at the incredible sophistication of its construction. Together, these 3 tools represented the pinnacle of Dwemer craftsmanship and magical engineering. Each was imbued with mythopoeic enchantments, magical effects so powerful that they bordered on the divine themselves. The tools were designed to work in perfect harmony, creating a system that could safely access and manipulate the heart of Lorcan's power for whatever purpose Kagrenac intended. But what exactly was that purpose? What did the chief tonal architect hope to achieve by tapping into the power of a divine heart? The answer lay in Kagrenac's ultimate vision for his people, a project so ambitious that it would have seemed like madness to anyone less brilliant and less arrogant than the greatest tonal architect who had ever lived. Kagrenac intended to create a new god, an artificial deity constructed entirely through Dwemer technology and powered by the heart of Lorcan. This mechanical god would serve as the vessel for his people's apotheosis, elevating the entire Dwemer race to divine status and freeing them forever from the limitations of mortal existence. The project had a name that would echo through history: Numidium, the brass god, the walking star, the ultimate expression of Dwemer ambition and technological mastery. The construction of Numidium represented more than just an engineering project. It was a theological statement, a declaration that the Dwemer could create their own divinity superior to the traditional gods worshipped by other races. Where other peoples grovelled before distant deities and begged for divine intervention, the Dwemer would craft their own god according to their own specifications. The scale of the project defied comprehension. Numidium was designed to be a colossal humanoid construct, 1,000 feet tall and possessed of power sufficient to reshape reality according to its creator's will. Its hands would be large enough to knock the moons from the sky. Its footsteps would shake the foundations of mountains. Its very presence would announce to all of Tamriel that the age of the old gods had ended and the time of Dwemer supremacy had begun. But such an ambitious project could not remain secret forever. Word of the Dwemer's activities began to spread beyond the borders of their underground empire, reaching the ears of peoples who viewed their plans with horror and outrage. The Chimer, the predecessors of the modern Duma, were particularly appalled by what they saw as the ultimate blasphemy against divine authority. The relationship between the Dwemer and the Chimer had always been complex. Despite their philosophical differences, the two peoples had maintained an uneasy alliance known as the First Council, a political arrangement that had brought relative peace to the region around Red Mountain. The Chimer practiced traditional forms of ancestor worship and divine veneration, viewing the gods as entities worthy of respect and reverence. The Dwemer's rejection of divine authority had always been a source of tension, but their useful technologies and military capabilities had made them valuable allies despite their religious peculiarities. The construction of Numidium shattered this delicate balance. To the Chimer, the idea of creating an artificial god was not just philosophically offensive, but actively dangerous. They believed that such hubris would inevitably bring divine retribution down upon everyone in the region, not just the blasphemous Dwemer. The very existence of the brass god represented a threat to the cosmic order that maintained stability throughout Tamriel. The Chimer Great Houses, led by the legendary hero Indoril Nerevar, called for immediate action against the Dwemer. Diplomatic protests were ignored. Economic pressure proved ineffective. Military threats were dismissed with the same arrogance that had characterized Dwemer interactions with other races for centuries. It became clear that only force would convince the Deep Folk to abandon their dangerous project. The declaration of war marked the end of the First Council and the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the political landscape of Eastern Tamriel. The War of the First Council pitted the technological superiority of the Dwemer against the traditional martial skills and divine favour of the Chimer. It was a clash between two fundamentally different approaches to existence, the rational materialism of the Deep Folk and the spiritual traditionalism of their surface-dwelling neighbours. The war lasted for 32 years, a grinding conflict that saw neither side able to achieve decisive victory. The Dwemer's advanced weaponry and mechanical armies gave them significant advantages in direct confrontation, but the Chimer's superior numbers and knowledge of surface terrain allowed them to maintain resistance against their technologically superior enemies. Underground battles raged through the tunnel networks beneath Red Mountain, while surface engagements spread across the ashen wastelands of Morrowind. Throughout the long years of warfare, Kagrenac continued his work on the Numidium project. The chief tonal architect viewed the conflict not as a distraction from his ultimate goal, but as proof of its necessity. The war demonstrated that other races would never willingly accept Dwemer's superiority. Only by achieving true godhood could his people transcend the limitations that made them vulnerable to the jealousy and ignorance of lesser civilizations. The tools he had crafted grew more sophisticated with each passing year. Wraithguard, Sunder, and Keening were refined and perfected until they represented the absolute pinnacle of tonal architecture. The heart of Lorcan pulsed with increasing intensity as Kagrenac's experiments brought him closer to understanding its true nature. The massive frame of Numidium took shape in the deepest chambers beneath Red Mountain, a mechanical colossus that would soon house the divine power necessary for the Dwemer's transformation. But time was running out. The war was taking its toll on Dwemer resources and morale. Despite their technological advantages, the constant fighting was weakening their ability to maintain their underground empire. Reports from the surface suggested that the Kaimer were preparing for a massive final assault that would bring the full might of their united great houses against the primary Dwemer stronghold beneath Red Mountain. Kagrenac realized that his grand project would have to be completed under battlefield conditions, with enemy forces literally at the gates of his most important workshops. The careful, methodical approach he had planned would have to be abandoned in favor of desperate improvisation. The activation of Numidium would have to proceed immediately, regardless of whether all the preparations had been completed. The stage was set for the final confrontation that would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the fate of an entire civilization. In the depths beneath Red Mountain, surrounded by the tools of his ambition and the mechanical shell of his artificial god, Kagrenac prepared to either elevate his people to divinity or destroy them in the attempt. The heart of Lorcan pulsed with anticipation, its divine power waiting to be unleashed upon a world that was about to witness either the birth of new gods or the most complete disappearance in all of recorded history. The final battle of the War of the First Council began like so many others before it, with the thunder of approaching armies echoing through the tunnels beneath Red Mountain. But this engagement would prove different from all the skirmishes and sieges that had preceded it. As Chimera forces under Nerevar's command pressed their assault against the deepest Dwemer strongholds, Kagrenac made a decision that would echo through eternity. In the year 700 of the First Era, with enemy warriors literally breaking down the doors of his most sacred workshops, the chief tonal architect activated his tools for the first and final time. The exact sequence of events that followed remains shrouded in mystery, witnessed only by a handful of participants, whose accounts would later become the stuff of legend and speculation. What we know with certainty is that Kagrenac struck the heart of Lorcan with Sunder, while wielding Keening and protected by Wraithguard, attempting to channel its divine essence into the waiting shell of Numidium. The activation created effects that defied every natural law the Dwemer had spent millennia cataloguing and understanding. Reality itself seemed to bend and twist around the heart as divine power flowed through Kagrenac's carefully crafted tools. The massive bronze frame of Numidium stirred to life, its mechanical systems responding to the godly energy coursing through its artificial veins. For a brief, terrifying moment, it appeared that the chief tonal architect's impossible vision might actually succeed. But something went catastrophically wrong. Whether it was the rushed nature of the activation, interference from the ongoing battle, or simply the hubris of attempting to harness forces beyond mortal comprehension, the process spiraled beyond Kagrenac's control. The power that was meant to elevate the Dwemer to godhood instead triggered something far more dramatic and permanent. In an instant that lasted both forever and no time at all, every single Dwemer on Nirn simply vanished. Not just those present at the battle, not just those within Red Mountain, but every member of the race across all of Tamriel and beyond. Miners in distant settlements, traders in foreign cities, scholars in isolated laboratories, craftsmen in their workshops, children in their beds, all of them disappeared simultaneously, leaving behind only empty spaces where living beings had stood moments before. The disappearance was so sudden and complete that many Dwemer were caught in the middle of their daily activities. In the previously untouched ruins of Bams Amshend beneath Mournhold, explorers would later discover piles of ash next to weapons and armor, positioned on chairs and in beds, exactly where people had been sitting or lying when the event occurred. These ash piles suggest that the Dwemer's physical forms were instantly reduced to dust, while their possessions remained untouched. The nature of the disappearance defied every attempt at explanation or understanding. This wasn't death as other races knew it. There were no bodies to bury, no clear moment of transition from life to death. The Dwemer had simply ceased to exist in any form that could be detected or comprehended by those left behind. Their cities remained perfectly preserved. Their machines continued to function. Their automatons maintained their eternal vigils, but their creators had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. The immediate aftermath of the disappearance brought the War of the First Council to an abrupt and bewildering end. Chimer forces, who had been fighting desperately against Dwemer defenders, suddenly found themselves facing empty corridors and abandoned fortifications. The mechanical guardians continued their programmed routines, but the intelligence that had directed them was gone. The great underground cities that had bustled with activity fell silent except for the hiss of steam and the grinding of gears. Nerevar and his allies found themselves victorious in a war that had ended without resolution. Their enemies hadn't been defeated in any conventional sense. They had simply disappeared, leaving behind mysteries that would puzzle scholars for thousands of years to come. The heart of Lorcan remained in its chamber beneath Red Mountain, still pulsing with divine energy, but now unguarded and accessible. Kagrenac's tools lay scattered where they had fallen, their purpose apparently fulfilled in ways their creator had never intended. The Chimer's reaction to their sudden victory mixed triumph with profound unease. They had achieved their goal of stopping the Numidium project, but the means by which that goal had been accomplished troubled them deeply. The complete disappearance of an entire race suggested forces at work that exceeded even their understanding of divine intervention and cosmic justice. Some interpreted the event as divine retribution for the Dwemer's blasphemous attempt to create their own god. The traditional gods had finally acted to punish those who had rejected their authority so completely. Others saw it as evidence of magical forces beyond mortal comprehension, a reminder that there were aspects of reality that even the most advanced civilizations couldn't safely manipulate. But perhaps the most unsettling interpretation was that the disappearance represented exactly what Kagrenac had intended. Perhaps the Dwemer hadn't vanished at all, but had simply transcended to a state of existence beyond mortal perception. The absence of bodies or clear evidence of death left open the possibility that the entire race had achieved some form of apotheosis, becoming something so fundamentally different from their original nature that they could no longer interact with the physical world. The preservation of Dwemer ruins in perfect condition supported this theory. If the disappearance had been a punishment or accident, one might expect their cities and machines to show signs of abandonment or decay. Instead, everything remained exactly as it had been at the moment of vanishing, as if the Dwemer had simply stepped out of reality while leaving their civilization intact for future discovery. The automatons that continued to patrol empty corridors provided perhaps the most haunting evidence of their creator's fate. These mechanical guardians maintained their vigilance with perfect dedication, protecting treasures and territories that no longer belonged to anyone. They followed programming that had been written by minds that no longer existed, carrying out duties for masters who might have transcended beyond any need for mechanical servants. The sophistication of these machines became even more apparent after the disappearance. Without their creators to maintain them, the automatons should have gradually broken down or malfunctioned. Instead, they continued to operate with the same precision and intelligence they had displayed when the Dwemer were still present. This suggested that the mechanical constructs possessed a level of autonomous functionality that exceeded what most scholars had previously believed possible. The mystery deepened when explorers began to encounter Dwemer ghosts in the abandoned ruins. These spectral entities appeared to be the remnants of the vanished race, aggressive spirits that attacked anyone who intruded upon their former domains. But these weren't typical undead in any conventional sense. They seemed to exist in a state between life and death, neither fully departed nor truly present in the physical world. The existence of these ghostly remnants suggested that some aspect of the Dwemer had indeed survived the Great Disappearance, though in a form so altered that they could no longer be considered truly alive. Perhaps the transformation that Kagrenac had attempted had partially succeeded, catching the Dwemer between mortality and divinity in a state that allowed neither full transcendence nor return to their original existence. Archaeological expeditions into Dwemer ruins revealed the incredible extent of their technological achievements while raising new questions about their ultimate fate. The cities they left behind weren't just empty buildings, but fully functional urban environments. Steam continued to flow through bronze pipes, lights still illuminated vast chambers, and ventilation systems maintained perfect air quality throughout sprawling underground complexes. The preservation of written materials provided tantalizing glimpses into Dwemer culture and philosophy, while frustratingly refusing to explain their disappearance. Texts found in their libraries revealed a people obsessed with rational understanding and technological advancement, but they contained no prophecies of vanishing or hints of impending transformation. The Dwemer had apparently approached their fate with the same methodical confidence they brought to all their endeavors. Among the most significant discoveries were detailed technical manuals describing the construction and operation of various Dwemer machines. These documents revealed engineering principles that seemed to operate according to laws of physics unknown to other races. The sophistication of their technology became even more apparent when scholars attempted to reverse engineer their devices, only to discover that essential components relied on materials and techniques that couldn't be replicated. The Dwemer metal itself posed an ongoing puzzle that demonstrated the completeness of their disappearance. This distinctive bronze-gold alloy possessed properties that made it superior to any material produced by later civilizations, yet no amount of study had revealed the secrets of its creation. The knowledge had vanished along with its creators, leaving behind only the finished products of their incomprehensible craftsmanship. Perhaps most remarkably, every attempt to create new Dwemer-style automatons had failed completely. The mechanical principles were clear enough from examination of existing constructs, but something essential was missing from all reproduction attempts. The spark of artificial intelligence that animated the original machines couldn't be duplicated, suggesting that their creation required knowledge or capabilities that had disappeared along with the Dwemer themselves. The scattered locations of Dwemer ruins across multiple provinces revealed the true extent of their civilization's reach. From the great underground cities of Skyrim to smaller outposts in Hammerfell and High Rock, the Dwemer had established a network of settlements that spanned much of northern Tamriel. The simultaneous abandonment of all these locations reinforced the mysterious nature of their disappearance, demonstrating that whatever had happened affected the entire race, regardless of geographic location. Trade goods found in ruins throughout Tamriel showed that the Dwemer had maintained extensive commercial relationships with surface peoples, despite their preference for underground living. Dwarven weapons and tools had been prized by other races for their superior quality and durability. The sudden cessation of this trade must have created economic disruption throughout the regions where Dwemer goods had been common, though historical records from the period are frustratingly sparse. The political implications of the disappearance extended far beyond the immediate end of the War of the First Council. The Dwemer had been major players in the balance of power throughout eastern Tamriel, their technological superiority making them valuable allies and dangerous enemies. Their sudden absence created a power vacuum that would take centuries to fill, reshaping the political landscape in ways that continued to influence events long after their vanishing. The Chimer's acquisition of Kagrenac's tools and access to the heart of Lorcan would prove to have consequences that echoed through the ages. The three legendary artifacts became central to the transformation of Chimer society, eventually playing a crucial role in the apotheosis of the beings who would become known as the Tribunal. The very tools that had destroyed their creators would elevate their enemies to godhood, creating a bitter irony that seemed to mock the Dwemer's rational confidence. But among all the empty cities and abandoned workshops, one mystery stood out above all others. In the vast caverns of Blackreach, in a workshop that had clearly been occupied at the moment of the Great Disappearance, explorers discovered evidence that not every Dwemer had vanished with their people. Tools lay scattered as if dropped in haste. Projects sat half-finished on workbenches. And most significantly, there were signs that someone had been working there recently. The implications were staggering. If even one Dwemer had survived the Great Disappearance, it meant that the event hadn't been absolute. Perhaps others had escaped the fate of their people through similar circumstances. Perhaps the secret of what had happened to the Deep Folk could still be uncovered through the testimony of a living witness. The search for this potential survivor would lead to one of the most remarkable discoveries in all of Tamrielic history, a meeting that would provide the only first-hand account of the Dwemer disappearance while raising even more questions about the ultimate fate of the Deep Folk. In the plague-ridden depths of a forgotten ruin, protected by diseases that had claimed countless explorers, dwelt the last living member of a vanished race, holding secrets that could illuminate the greatest mystery in Elder Scrolls lore. The discovery that shattered every assumption about the completeness of the Dwemer vanishing came not through systematic exploration or scholarly investigation, but through the desperate curiosity of treasure hunters willing to brave the most dangerous ruins in all of Tamriel. Deep within the corpse-strewn tunnels of a plague-infected Dwemer facility, past chambers where diseased air had claimed the lives of countless explorers, a remarkable figure waited in isolation. Yagrum Bagan represented an impossibility made flesh, a living contradiction to everything scholars thought they knew about the Great Disappearance. Here was a Dwemer, unmistakably one of the Deep Folk despite the ravages that disease had worked upon his body, existing in defiance of the event that had erased his entire race from existence. His presence raised immediate questions that struck at the heart of every theory about what had happened in that fateful moment beneath Red Mountain. The circumstances of Yagrum's survival were as extraordinary as his continued existence. At the time when his people vanished from Nirn, he had been travelling in what he described as the outer realms, dimensions beyond the normal boundaries of Mundus, where few mortals had ever ventured. These weren't the familiar planes of Oblivion, or the distant reaches of Aetherius, but stranger spaces that existed in the gaps between conventional reality. His journey to these outer dimensions hadn't been undertaken lightly or by accident. Like many of his people, Yagrum had been driven by an insatiable curiosity about the fundamental nature of existence, a desire to explore and understand realms that others considered beyond mortal reach. The advanced techniques of Dwemer dimensional manipulation had made such journeys possible, though they remained dangerous endeavours that few attempted and fewer survived. The irony of his salvation was profound. While his people pursued their ultimate transformation through Kagrenac's divine experiment, Yagrum had been pursuing knowledge in the furthest reaches of existence itself. The very isolation that had protected him from sharing his race's fate had also prevented him from understanding what had happened until it was far too late to intervene or participate. His return to Tamriel revealed a world transformed by his people's absence. The underground cities he had known as bustling centres of technological innovation stood empty and silent. The communication networks that had once connected Dwemer settlements across continents carried only the echoes of automated systems maintaining their eternal vigil. The workshops where master craftsmen had created wonders now housed only the mechanical guardians programmed to protect treasures no one would ever claim. The psychological impact of discovering himself to be the sole survivor of his entire civilization would have broken a lesser mind. Yagrum found himself confronting not just personal loss, but existential isolation on a scale that no other being in recorded history had ever experienced. He was a living representative of a vanished world, carrying within his memory the complete cultural heritage of a people who no longer existed anywhere else in reality. His initial response was methodical and rational, reflecting the analytical approach that characterized Dwemer thinking. Rather than succumbing to despair or madness, Yagrum embarked upon a systematic investigation of his people's fate. He traveled throughout Tamriel, visiting every known Dwemer settlement and ruin, searching for any clue that might explain what had happened, or reveal other survivors who might have escaped the Great Vanishing. The search consumed years of his life and took him to the most remote and dangerous locations across the continent. He explored ruins that had been sealed since the disappearance, delved into archives that contained the final records of his civilization, and examined the mechanical systems that continued to function without their creators. Each discovery added to his understanding of the scope and nature of the event, while simultaneously confirming the terrible completeness of his isolation. The evidence he gathered painted a picture of instantaneous and universal transformation. The ash piles found positioned exactly where living beings had been. Moments before the disappearance suggested that physical forms had been reduced to dust in a fraction of a second. The perfect preservation of all non-living materials indicated that the effect had been precisely targeted, affecting only the Dwemer themselves while leaving their creations untouched. More disturbing were the signs of the event's supernatural nature. Normal death, even sudden death, left traces that could be analysed and understood. The Dwemer disappearance had occurred according to principles that seemed to operate outside conventional physical laws. The simultaneous affecting of every member of the race, regardless of their location, suggested forces that transcended normal spatial limitations. Yagrum's investigation revealed that his people's vanishing had been accompanied by phenomena that defied rational explanation. Witnesses among other races reported strange lights emanating from Dwemer settlements at the moment of disappearance, followed by an eerie silence that seemed to muffle sound itself. Some described feeling a tremor that affected not just the ground, but the very fabric of reality, as if existence itself had been momentarily disrupted. The mechanical systems that continued to function after their creator's disappearance provided the most unsettling evidence of all. These weren't simple automated devices following predetermined programming, but sophisticated constructs that seemed to possess genuine intelligence and adaptability. Their continued operation suggested that some essential aspect of Dwemer consciousness had been incorporated into their design, raising questions about the nature of artificial intelligence and the relationship between creator and creation. As his search progressed, Yagrum began to develop theories about what might have happened to his people. The evidence pointed toward a transformation rather than simple destruction, a change so fundamental that it had removed the Dwemer from normal reality while leaving traces of their presence in the mechanical systems they had created. The precision and completeness of the event suggested that it had been intentional rather than accidental, the result of Kagrenac's experiment rather than divine punishment or magical catastrophe. The most compelling theory involved the concept of transcendence, the idea that the Dwemer had achieved exactly what Kagrenac had intended, but in a form that removed them from conventional existence. Perhaps they had become something so fundamentally different from their original nature that they could no longer interact with the physical world in recognizable ways. The absence of bodies or clear evidence of death supported this interpretation, suggesting transformation rather than termination. But transcendence to what? And why had he been spared from sharing their fate? Yagrum's isolation in the outer realms at the crucial moment suggested that the transformation had been limited to those present within normal dimensional boundaries. The divine power channeled through Kagrenac's tools had apparently affected only those Dwemer who existed within the conventional space-time framework of Mundus. This realization brought both relief and profound sorrow. He had been saved from whatever fate had claimed his people, but that salvation came at the cost of eternal separation from everything he had ever known or loved. He was free to continue existing as himself, but condemned to do so in complete isolation from his own kind. The years of searching eventually took their toll in ways that went beyond mere psychological strain. During his travels through the most dangerous and remote Dwemer ruins, Yagram contracted a wasting disease that began to transform his body in horrible ways. The exact nature of this affliction remained unclear, but its effects were devastating and progressive, gradually robbing him of mobility and threatening to end his unique existence. The disease forced him to abandon his active search for answers and seek refuge in locations where he could survive despite his deteriorating condition. The irony was bitter. Having survived the complete disappearance of his race, he now faced the prospect of dying alone from a mundane affliction that would render his unique knowledge and experiences meaningless. His condition worsened steadily, transforming his once proud Dwemer physique into something grotesque and barely recognizable. The disease affected not just his physical form, but his ability to travel and explore, confining him to increasingly limited spaces where he could receive the care necessary to survive. The last living link to one of Tamriel's greatest civilizations found himself trapped in a slowly failing body, watching his memories become the only remaining repository of Dwemer culture and knowledge. Yet, even in his deteriorated state, Yagram's mind remained sharp, and his dedication to understanding his people's fate never wavered. He continued to analyze the evidence he had gathered, refining his theories about the disappearance and developing insights that only someone with his unique perspective could achieve. His scholarly approach to his own tragedy reflected the rational methodology that had defined Dwemer civilization throughout its history. The isolation that had saved him from sharing his people's fate also preserved within him the complete cultural memory of the deep folk. He carried within his mind the accumulated wisdom of millennia, the technological secrets that had made his people the most advanced civilization in Tamrielic history, and the philosophical insights that had driven them to attempt their ultimate transformation. In a very real sense, he had become a living museum of everything the Dwemer had achieved and aspired to become. His theories about the disappearance evolved as he pondered the evidence in solitude. The more he considered the circumstances surrounding Kagrenac's final experiment, the more convinced he became that his people had achieved some form of success rather than suffering complete failure. The precision of the event, its universal scope, and the preservation of their mechanical creations all suggested a transformation that had been carefully orchestrated rather than accidentally triggered. Perhaps the Dwemer had indeed transcended mortality as Kagrenac had intended, but in a way that removed them from normal existence entirely. They might have become something akin to the divine forces they had sought to harness, entities that existed beyond the limitations of physical form, but also beyond the ability to interact with the mortal world they had left behind. This interpretation offered both hope and despair. If his people had achieved their goal of transcendence, then their disappearance represented the ultimate success of Dwemer civilization, rather than its tragic failure. They had become something greater than mortal, fulfilling the rational materialism that had always defined their culture. But they had also become something completely inaccessible to those left behind, including their sole surviving kinsmen. The question of whether they retained consciousness and identity in their transformed state remained unanswerable. Yagram could only speculate about whether his people existed somewhere beyond mortal perception, aware of their achievement, but unable to communicate it to those still bound by conventional reality. The possibility that they might be watching him, the last remnant of their former existence, added another layer of poignancy to his solitary vigil. As the years passed and his condition continued to deteriorate, Ygrum faced the probability that he would carry the secrets of the Dwemer disappearance to his grave. The knowledge he had accumulated through his unique experiences would die with him, leaving future scholars to puzzle over the mystery without benefit of the only eyewitness account that could illuminate the truth. The weight of this responsibility pressed upon him as heavily as his physical afflictions. He was not just the last Dwemer, but the final repository of his people's legacy, the only source of first-hand information about their culture, their achievements, and their ultimate fate. When he died, an entire civilization would truly cease to exist in any recoverable form. Yet his scholarly nature compelled him to continue seeking understanding, even as his body failed him. The rational methodology that had driven Dwemer civilization throughout its history demanded that he pursue truth regardless of personal cost. Even if he could never solve the mystery completely, he could at least preserve what knowledge he had gained for those who might continue the investigation after his death. The mechanical guardians that continued their eternal patrol through empty Dwemer ruins served as constant reminders of his people's achievement and his own isolation. These automatons possessed something that he increasingly lacked: the ability to maintain their purpose indefinitely without succumbing to the decay that affected organic life. They were, in their own way, more successful inheritors of Dwemer legacy than he had proven to be, but they were also reminders of what had been lost. The intelligence that animated these constructs was artificial, however sophisticated it might be. They could perform their programmed functions with perfect precision, but they could never truly understand what they were protecting, or why their vigilance mattered. The consciousness that had created them, the minds that had imbued them with purpose and direction, had passed beyond reach of mechanical preservation. In his darkest moments, Ygrum wondered whether his survival had been a blessing or a curse. To live as the sole representative of a vanished people carried responsibilities and sorrows that perhaps no individual should have to bear. The knowledge he possessed was precious beyond measure, but it was also a burden that grew heavier with each passing year of solitude. The disease that ravaged his body served as a constant reminder of his mortality and the finite nature of his guardianship over Dwemer legacy. Unlike the mechanical constructs that could maintain their vigil indefinitely, he was bound by the limitations of flesh and blood that his people had sought to transcend. His death would represent not just personal extinction, but the final severing of any direct connection between the present world and the civilization that had once stood at the pinnacle of technological achievement. As we near the end of our journey through the halls of the vanished deep folk, we find ourselves confronting the same questions that have puzzled scholars for thousands of years. The mystery of the Dwemer disappearance remains as compelling and unanswerable as ever, a puzzle that grows more complex rather than clearer with each new discovery.